we must decide, what kind of nation are we going to be? Are we going to be a nation that accepts political violence as a norm? Are we going to be a nation where we allow partisan election officials to overturn the legally expressed will of the people? Are we going to be a nation that lives not by the light of the truth, but in the shadow of lies? We cannot allow ourselves to be that kind of nation. The way forward is to recognize the truth and to live by it.
Hey again, everyone. It is 5 o'clock in New York. I'm Alicia Menendez, in for Nicole Wallace. On the first anniversary of the Capitol insurrection, President Joe Biden delivered a forceful and moving address that called on our nation's better angels. He spoke about the danger of denying the truth of that day, about recognizing the lies and selfishness that had got us to that point. Now, as this Saturday marks the third anniversary of the attack, President Biden is ready to yet again recognize that hugely consequential moment, this time with the next presidential race just on the horizon. The New York Times reports, even before a single vote is cast in the Republican Party's nominating race, Mr. Biden and his team are treating former President Donald Trump as their de facto opponent in the general election. They're seeking to frame the contest not as a traditional referendum on the incumbent president and his governance of the nation, but as an existential battle to save the country from a dangerous opponent. On the anniversary of the 6th, Biden will speak at Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, where George Washington commanded troops during the Revolutionary War. As the nation's first president, Washington voluntarily resigned after 2 terms, beginning the peaceful transfer of power between American presidents, the process which Trump attempted to halt almost 250 years later. The political and legal environments in which Biden will make these remarks, quite different from the day of the insurrection, even different from when he made that speech 2 years ago. As Bill Kristol and Jeffrey Tillis write at The Bulwark, the threat from the former president is now greater than it was when the Capitol was stormed. Why? It's all due to the Republican Party's acquiescence to Trump. They write, those who stood up to him are now gone. The Republicans who broke with Trump have either been marginalized or returned to singing his praises. All but 2 of the representatives who voted for his impeachment are out of office. If he were returned to the White House, he would only have sycophants around him and none of these so-called adults in the room who, however ineffectually, tried in his first term to check his worst impulses. The pro-insurrectionists, joined by anti-insurrectionists, are in control of the Republican Party. And the forces marshaled behind Donald Trump to subvert and overthrow important features of our constitutional democracy are stronger than they were in January 2021, or for that matter, in January 2017. Just moments ago, Trump asked the United States Supreme Court to ensure he stays on primary ballots nationwide. That is according to a report just breaking in the Washington Post. We're going to have more on that in a moment. But that is where we start with the host of the podcast, A Word with Jason Johnson, and professor of politics and journalism at Morgan State University. The Jason Johnson is here. Plus, host of the podcast Fast Politics and special correspondent for Vanity Fair, Molly-Jean Fast, former top State Department official during the Obama administration, Rick Stengel, and editor-at-large for The Bulwark, Charlie Sykes. Charlie, your colleagues at The Bulwark, they wrote that piece. I would call it chilling. Talk about why we are closer to constitutional failure today than we were, let's say, 3 years ago.
Well, because Donald Trump has been radicalized, and he's radicalized the Republican Party. He has managed to revise the history of what happened on January 6th, and any lingering hope that the Republican Party would serve as a guardrail or a check on his ambitions, I think has been destroyed. I think that those hopes have evaporated. A Trump 2.0 administration would be far more aggressive, would not have the kinds of adults in the room who restrain Donald Trump. And Donald Trump has made it absolutely clear. I mean, there's really no subtlety or ambiguity about what he would do once he got the levers of power, that the Trump, a second Trump administration would be about retribution, would be about revenge, would be about tearing down many of the constitutional norms that turned out to be far more fragile and I'm afraid that we had been complacent about. So their warning, I think, is simply a statement of the reality that we face in 2024.
Rick, I want to read just the last few lines of the Bulwark piece. They write, January 6th, it turns out, was a rehearsal for the true upheaval, the far deeper insurrection that Trump now intends to lead if reelected. January 6th was prologue. The election year of 2024 will be the decisive drama on the main stage, and its outcome very much in doubt. If 1/6 was a dress rehearsal, right, and accountability, I think you could argue still in process, where does that leave us then in the run-up to this November's elections, Rick?
Well, at a very scary point, at an inflection point. I think Charlie is right. I mean, I all hope that January 6th was a period, not a comma, that it was an end point rather than the beginning of something. But it turns out it is the beginning of something. And this idea that democracy is on the ballot in 2024 is absolutely true. And that's what President Biden is talking about. I think there are a lot of voters that will vote for democracy, that don't want to vote for an authoritarian leader or an authoritarian system. But there are also, unfortunately, authoritarian voters, as social scientists used to call them, people who want a strong man, people who in some recent polls showed they want a leader who will violate the rules to get things done. That is the existential issue that's ahead of us, and it couldn't be more important.
Jason, here's the thing. Biden's campaign manager, Julie Chavez Rodriguez, recently said on a press call, our message is clear and simple. We are running a campaign like the fate of our democracy depends on it, because it does. I take Rick's point that there are voters who are going to show up and they're going to vote for democracy. There are also voters who are going to show up and vote for authoritarianism. I think part of the challenge is that does not constitute the totality of the electorate, because, yes, democracy is on the line. You look at polling, it's not necessarily top of mind for persuadable voters.
Everybody on this panel, you included right now, has heard this is the most important election of your lifetime for the last 4 elections, right? Like that's what we've all heard. And that motivates people who already care about elections. But Alicia, as you've mentioned, there's a good 12 to 15% of people out there that doesn't motivate them. It's not that they like the idea of an impending dictatorship, but that's not going to motivate them the same way as student loans will, the same way as foreign policy will, the same way as inflation will, the same way as gas prices will, the same way that they may be frustrated about shutdowns and lockdowns that happened under COVID. So there has to be a message for that middle of the road group of people. I think Joe Biden has one. I think he can talk about policy successes. I think he can talk about the economy. But I think to the degree that we get caught up in this conversation about saving democracy only, there are a lot of Americans who don't think democracy has worked very well for them, for both good and bad reasons. And so if that's your main thing, saving a system that I feel as a voter has never really worked for me, you're going to miss out on those people. You got to give them something more tangible to be excited about the vote in 2024. And you have to pass legislation so they can actually vote, as opposed to sitting back and hoping that they can make their own bricks with straw, as opposed to being able to go out and vote as easily as possible.
Right, Molly, there are actual structural issues here. One of those structural issues is the fact that defending democracy, defending the rule of law, that used to be a bipartisan effort. The fact that you now have Republicans turning their back on America's foundations in the name of one man, the threat to democracy, the threat to the peaceful transfer of power, how did that become just something that the Democratic Party cared about?
Yeah, I have to say it's really scary in my mind how much the Republican Party has made authoritarianism a sort of litmus test. You know, it used to be, are you loyal to Trump? Now it's, are you loyal to this kind of pro-dictator-like rhetoric? And you'll hear Trump supporters say, yes, he wants to be a dictator for a day. Isn't that funny? Maybe we need a dictator for the day. And I think that's really scary. And I don't know. I mean, I was talking to an academic who studies authoritarianism today at Harvard, and we were talking about it. And he said he's actually more worried about America than he is about some of these other countries, because we have only one party that continues to believe in democracy. And we have a second party. I mean, look, if Nikki Haley had been the nominee, perhaps it would be different. But with DeSantis and with Vivek, you have 3 candidates there, all of whom, and Trump, all of whom embrace this kind of authoritarianism in a really scary way. So it turns out that Trumpism has, you know, these Republicans have turned a blind eye and they've let Trumpism grow, and it's grown into this authoritarian nightmare. And I do think Biden's right. Luckily for Biden, this worked very well in the midterms, too. Voters actually really did respond to this. So I think he has a precedent for this. But yeah, it's really scary. It's the do you want to have elections election.
Right. I mean, Rick, Trump has turned his campaign into a fight for retribution. He has praised authoritarians. He has quoted Hitler. As alarming as all of that is, as you often remind me, what is more alarming is how many Americans are not repelled by it, but rather drawn to it. What will this election, what will it reveal about who we are as a nation? We keep saying this is not who we are. What if voters tell us otherwise?
Yeah, I don't even like to talk about the alternative because I don't want to put it in anyone's head. But what we've seen in America and around the world is this weaponization of grievance, that people feel that somehow the government not only is not working for them, it's working against them. And Trump is empowering those people to kind of reject the system. And, you know, one of the things I've thought for a long time, and having been in government, is that government doesn't do a very good job of explaining what government does. And we also kind of, gave people too much credit for, like we said, you could be whatever you wanted to be. Well, you can't be whatever you want to be. So people feel a grievance about that. And Trump is weaponizing that grievance to vote against the system that has actually done more for more people than any system in history.